So, are you feeling stressed out? What is happening with your body and what can you do about it? So, many students find that this time in their life can be extremely stressful. You're worried about your exams and your grades. This may be the first time that you've lived on your own, and so you may be worried about paying the rent. You may be worried about connecting again with your family and being there for them. You've got a lot of things on your plate, right? So, what is actually happening with your body when you're feeling stressed? And what can you do about it to help reduce the negative impacts that can come about with stress? We're going to see as well that stress can also impact your sleep, right? And so this can be kind of a double whammy when worrying keeps you up at night. And I think it kind of builds when you're in that kind of state. If you're already worrying, then it just keeps escalating, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not getting enough sleep. I really need to sleep before my presentation tomorrow or whatever's going on, and I can't get to sleep. And then you're worrying about not being able to sleep and you keep looking at the clock and it just spirals. And then, by 5 in the morning, you think that you might have a brain tumor, right? So stress is not a good situation and it often couples with less sleep or poor sleep quality. And we'll see the impacts of sleep later on in the course. So take a few minutes and think about the things that cause you the greatest stress currently right now. You may even want to just write them down or just take note of them. What are your biggest stressors? All right. So hopefully you've been able to figure out a few things that cause you the most stress currently right now. Or if you had a tough time with this, that's great. Maybe you're not feeling so stressed just yet, as the term has just started. I always feel that way. The beginning of term to me just feels wonderful. It gets to be like more stressful and more stressful as you get closer to exams, and then I have grading, which increases my stress load as well. So now let's think about how zebras experience stress. Okay, that may seem like a weird question to come up and ask you, but the things that you probably noted about your stress experiences, right? They are things that are more provoked by your thoughts and your feelings and your attitudes towards situations than things that are in your immediate context that can cause stressful events. Right? So if you're a zebra and you're out on the savannah and you're eating and going about your business, something that may be a stressful event to you is if that lion is stalking you and all of a sudden he jumps out of the bushes, he's chasing you, you go into overdrive and you're running away from the lion, right? That is a stressful experience for a zebra, right? The zebra is not going to be up at night worrying about his exams that he's got to take the next day or getting stressed because the traffic is bad and you're going to be late for a meeting, right? So the zebra experiences a stressful event and then it's gone, right? He either gets away from the lion or he's lunch, right? And if he gets away from the lion, that stressful event like subsides and he doesn't have to think about it anymore. He can go back to eating the grass on the savannah and saying, phew, I made it through that time. That's great. But we tend to carry stress with us. And this can make it, instead of being an acute situation where you have stress in an immediate environment and it happens all at once and then it dissipates and it's gone, that's an acute situation. Stress for people can become chronic, right? And you're feeling stressed all of the time and you're activating these stress pathways kind of inappropriately for how we developed the stress response system in the body. We developed initially like the zebra, right? Our stress response was supposed to be something that enabled us to respond to an immediate dangerous situation and then get over it fairly quickly. But in our modern day society, we can get this chronically activated. So it's not just as simple as having a bad hair day. So, Robert Sapolsky is one of my favorite scientists. He's out of Stanford, and I have to say that if they had scientist cards like they had baseball cards, my Robert Sapolsky card would be right up there with like Einstein. Yeah, I mean that. So, he's written a number of books, and one of those is Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, but Humans Do, and highly recommend it. And I have to preface that the next few lectures that we're going to go through, I have gleefully borrowed some of the material that he has presented in this book to share with you because it is really cool research that he's doing. And you guys are going to watch one of his documentaries as well this week on his research with baboons. So, and how baboon societies actually are kind of mimics for human societies, and they get very similar chronic stress induced diseases that we do. All right, so there is my preface. What he does is he looks at their social connections and looks at stress in the baboon populations. And you might think, well, the baboons are out there on the savannah too. Shouldn't they experience stress like the zebra does? Well, apparently, baboon society can be very stressful. They do a lot of kind of mean, nasty things to each other, and they have hierarchies that rival our own in some ways. And they actually experience stress much the same way that we do, and they can experience chronic stress events based on their status or level in the society. So look forward to seeing that later this week. But now in our lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about what stress is in the sense of what's going on inside our bodies. So what changes occur with stress inside the body. And then we're going to take a look at how this affects our health. And then, of course, what can we do about it to help limit negative health effects? So Robert Sapolsky's documentary will focus a lot on the baboon populations and analyze their social stress. But some of the key findings that we see in there are that when baboons are at the top or the bottom of the pyramid, they experience much more stress than if they're in the middle of the social hierarchy, right? And the ones that are at the bottom that get picked on the most have the worst outcomes from that chronic stress. The ones at the top have less worse outcomes than the ones at the bottom, but they have worse outcomes typically than the ones that are in the middle and kind of fly under the radar and don't get picked on as much. They spend more time grooming with the females, but they're not like in charge of anything, and they don't spend a lot of time fighting. Like the other baboons that are lobbying for that top dog or alpha male position. So you'll learn more about that when you watch the documentary. But this is what leads baboons to be a good model for human society and kind of how the body responds to stress and what's going on with that. So baboons can get ulcers, whereas we really don't see that zebras get ulcers. And it's because they don't have that kind of social hierarchy networking that's going on in the baboon population. So when zebras experience their types of stress, it's more of an acute stressor that's there for a short period of time and then it's gone and diffused and they can go back to being their cuddly, cute little selves. So what happens exactly then when you have to run away from that lion, right? So you've got to activate energy release, right? You need to run away and you need to go now, right? So you need to break open the sugars and the fats, break them down and power muscle contraction so that you can run away, so you can kick the lion in the face and you can get away and live another day. Right? To help you do all this, your blood pressure goes up and your heart rate increases. Your breathing rate is also going to increase, and certain aspects of your memory are actually improved. And you may feel like your senses are sharper. And so maybe you've had an experience like this where time seems to slow down in a very stressful situation, and you can see things like coming in slow motion. So, all of these processes then are things that increase during stress. So, some processes are also going to decrease during stress, right? So, you've got this bountiful energy release. You want that to go to powering muscle contraction so that you can run away. Fight or flight, baby. Right? So, other things that aren't contributing to that are going to be inhibited inside the body. So during a fight or flight response, digestion is inhibited. Growth and reproduction are inhibited. You don't have time to think about that right now. You got to get away. Sexual drive is increased and immunity is also inhibited. Although there's some conflicting research here that shows that sometimes initially immunity might spike because you might get an open wound or something, and having a more profound immune response when you're initially stressed could be a good thing. But if it's chronic, immunity can go down. And sometimes during a stress response, pain can become blunted. So you've heard of people being stabbed or things like that, and they didn't even feel it, right? This is because they're so stressed, and all that adrenaline that's going on in their body will blunt that pain response initially. It doesn't matter if the lion is going to scratch and claw at you and maybe get some claws in there. You still have to run away. You can't, stop because you have a wound, right? So pain is blunted. So as we've said, the stress for the zebra is going to be acute. That means, again, that it happens in a very short period of time, and then phew, that's over, right? So it's not going to be chronic. Chronic is the opposite of acute. So chronic stress, the way we can experience stress due to things like paperwork that's due, or maybe something in your job is due, or maybe somebody in your household is experiencing a health issue, and that's very stressful as well. Or you have to act as a caregiver for someone. So chronic stress is maladaptive. We weren't meant to experience chronic stress all the time. Stress should be acute and then gone. So we're going to talk about some of the processes that help us regulate this balance with stress, and what happens when we have chronic stress around and how it becomes maladaptive. So to do that, we need to talk a little bit about these processes of homeostasis and allostasis. So in biology, homeostasis is the state of steady internal physical and chemical conditions that are maintained by living systems. We need to have a constant level of blood glucose, for example. If the blood glucose drops too low, this will shut off your brain and other body functions, and you can die very quickly and go into a coma. If you have too much blood glucose, this can cause disease states like diabetes. So the homeostatic range of blood glucose has to be maintained in that balance, right? And so that's really this concept of homeostasis. There's a lot of other things inside the body that need to be maintained within a small range. Things like temperature, right? We can't get too hot or too cold. You get hypothermic or you get hyperthermic, and you can have heat stroke, for example. Or you get hypothermia, which means you get really, really cold and can start having bad things happen, body parts freezing and dying. So the body has these sensor response systems that are set up for these homeostatic processes that help keep the body in balance. So this is much the same way that our thermostats are going to talk to our heaters within our homes. There's some optimal set point, right? And your body has some sensor and it's looking for some stimulus. Is it too hot? It's got to turn on the air conditioner things and make it cooler. Is it too cold? It's got to turn on the heater and make it warmer, right? Your body has these types of responses in them so that you can maintain a critical range that is required for these different parameters that need to be maintained in a very small range. So we talked about temperature and blood sugar levels already, blood pressure, acid base balance, fluid volume inside the body, calcium levels, and a bunch of other things are maintained in these homeostatic ranges that are optimal for life. So, what's the difference between homeostasis then and this other term that's been on the other two slides, allostasis? What is allostasis and how does it differ? So, allostasis is a newer formulation of the term homeostasis, and it moves away from this concept of homeostasis having an ideal set point, mainly because ideal may shift a little bit depending on the current set of circumstances that a person or other living creature is going to find itself in. So, allostasis recognizes that there is no single ideal set steady state condition in life and that different stressors are going to elicit different response patterns inside an organism. So, this term of allostasis gives us a little bit of a broader view for looking at the effects of stress and many of the health consequences that come with stress. So now let's talk about the term stress. Where did this come from and what does this really mean? So stress is defined in physics as the force per unit area applied to a material, right? You can put stress on a material, right? You put the force pushing in from both sides, you're going to have compression stress. If you're pulling apart, you'll have tensile stress. If you are having forces that are opposing each other, one coming at the top, one coming at the bottom, this causes shear force stress. We see that in like earthquake zones, for example, when plates are sliding against each other. They have shear stress, right? So how does this term stress then get related to human beings and our stress response? So this was coined in the early 1930s by Hans Seyle, and he adapted this concept of stress to biological systems where he defined stress as the body's response to outside stimuli that disrupt the homeostatic balance. So we can now replace that definition. Instead of saying homeostatic balance, we can say allostatic balance. So we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about Hans Seyle and the initial experiments that he did to help us define what stress is inside the body. So Hans Seyle came across this concept really serendipitously, like so many experiments happen, right? So Sir Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin by accident, right? He found some mold growing on bread and it killed the bacteria, and wow, we've got antibiotics. So this was one of those type of serendipitous findings. So Hans Seyle was trying to study something else completely. In the 1930s, Seyle was just beginning his work in endocrinology, which is the study of hormonal communication inside the body. So naturally, as a young, unheard of assistant professor, he was fishing around for something to start his own research career. So a biochemist down the hall from him had just isolated some sort of extract from the ovary of a rat, and his colleagues were all talking about it and wondering what this ovarian extract did to the body. So Seyle wanted to find out. So he obtained some of the stuff from the biochemist and he set about studying its effects in rats. So what he did was he injected the rats daily with the ovarian extract, and at the end of the study, he did this for a number of months, injecting them daily. And when he examined the rats, he discovered something extraordinary. The rats had peptic ulcers, greatly enlarged adrenal glands, and shrunken immune tissues. He was delighted. Hadn't he just discovered the mysterious effects of the ovarian extract? Now you might be saying, ovarian extract, that sounds like it should have some effect in reproductive processes, right? Well, yes, so that's not all of the story. So, being a good scientist, Selye also ran a control group. So, he also injected a number of rats daily with the saline solution alone, or a salt solution alone, that didn't contain any of the ovarian extract. And at the end of this experiment, lo and behold, the control rats had the same peptic ulcers, enlarged adrenal glands, and atrophy of tissues of the immune system. So it wasn't really the ovarian extract that was doing any of this. What was going on here? So, your average budding scientist at this point might throw up his or her hands and futilely apply to business school instead. But Selye instead thought back to his experiments and he noted that he was actually not very adept at handling the rats during the experiment. So Selye would try to inject the rats, he would miss, he maybe drop them, and then he would spend half the morning chasing the rats around the room, or vice versa, flailing with the broom to get them out from behind the sink, and so on. So Selye reasoned that it was his less than trauma-free injections that might be causing the observations. Perhaps, he thought, these changes in the rats' bodies were some sort of unspecific or non-specific responses of the body to what he called generic unpleasantness. So to test this idea, he put some rats on the roof of the research building in the winter and others down in the boiler room where it was very hot. And then still others were exposed to forced exercise or to surgical procedures. All of these things would not be allowed in today's research facility. They would not really be humane treatment of the animals. And it was actually because partly of Selye's research that we have more protections for animal research now. So in all of these cases where he was essentially abusing these rats, he found increased incidences of peptic ulcers, adrenal enlargement, and atrophy of immune tissues. So, like I was saying, experiments like this are now thought to be cruel and are more highly regulated. But at that time, we really didn't know what would happen to the animals. So Selye's experiments led us to two important conclusions that have helped shape our current research and understanding about the stress response and its effects on disease states. These conclusions are that the body has surprisingly similar set of responses, which he called the general adaptation syndrome, but we now call it the stress response. And that this stress response happens to a broad array of stressors. And if stressors go on for too long, they can make you sick, right? So those are the two major findings, right? One stress response for many things. And if the stress is too much, it can make you ill. So let's end this section just reassessing what we've learned today. We had some key definitions about homeostasis and allostasis. We also defined stress both in a physical and a biological sense, so you should be familiar with those key definitions. We also took a look at Hans Selye's experiment and where he found that stressors, or what he called at the time general unpleasantness, can lead to disease. And now we're going to switch modes and we'll talk about some key features of scientific experiments like the ones that Hans Selye conducted.